Hello. Today we're interviewing Thomas Barrie. Did I pronounce that right? He recently received the Holladay Medal for Excellence, which is the highest faculty medal that NC State gives out. And he's got many other awards that mostly involve education, outreach, and also his research. And he is the director of the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Initiative. So I'm excited to talk with him today. So the first question is, what is your job title?
Well, I'm a professor of architecture, and so I'm a tenured faculty member in the School of Architecture. So that's the title. The job description is probably part of your question in terms of what do I do, right? Because every professor does something different. We all teach and we all do research. In my case, I teach at both ends of the curriculum. I teach our freshmen in our undergraduate program. I teach a course called Introduction to Architecture, which is just what it sounds like. It's an introduction to a full range of aspects of the discipline and profession of architecture. And I end up on the other side of it, teaching the very last studios in the graduate program, we'll call the Advanced Architectural Design Studios. And those are the ones where I do a lot of my outreach studios, mostly teaching affordable housing. I also teach graduate seminars in my research area and teach a beginning design studio for our incoming, what we call Track 3 program, as a 3-year program for students who have a degree in some other discipline who come in and do a 3.5 year Master of Architecture program.
Yeah, I was interested in possibly doing that because I'm a structural engineer, so I couldn't get the 2-year one.
Yeah, we'd be glad to have you.
So next question is, how long have you been teaching at NC State?
I just finished my 22nd year.
Okay. And now we're going to switch to more background. So when you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I didn't have any clear ideas, as a kid, what I wanted to do when I grew up. That career decisions came much later. I was always a kid who, though, loved to draw. I identified myself as an artist in high school, and I was always a kid and a young man who loved to build things. I was, I would say, always a kind of creative kid, building things, dreaming up things, and exploring the world through artifacts and drawings and so forth. So.
And where are you from?
Nobody's from anywhere anymore, of course, right? And that's not such a bad thing. But I was born in Massachusetts, and that's where I spent the first years of my life. I lived there till I was 16, and grew up in a small, typical New England town, south of Boston, quite close to Boston, seashore town. And so I'm from Massachusetts, but left there, but eventually ended up back there after I'd finished my Master of Architecture degree, and that's where I started my work in practice, and where a lot of things happened to me, including getting married. In Boston, but since then, also my wife and I then have lived in a number of places before I ended up here at NC State, and those were just different academic appointments.
So it sounds like, based off your childhood, that architecture was a pretty straightforward path between your interest to your major. Was that the case? Did you have any struggle to decide to become an architect?
I mean, in retrospect, no, but like any or at least most young people, and I mean this quite positively, I wasn't sure. I didn't really know. I didn't have a clear picture, and I also was very interested in literature, and so I actually have an undergraduate degree in English literature, and it was during the course of completing that degree, which I really enjoyed doing, and still find very valuable education. I decided that it was really architecture I wanted to do, because at that point, I'm in my 20s and I'm working a lot of construction jobs, which I really enjoyed doing. And so it was that point I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. And so for me, the path was, okay, so I'll finish this degree and then go to a 3.5 year MArch program like we have at NC State. So that was the path, but it was not clear at first. And I actually think I encourage everybody to be unclear for a while so you can explore and consider lots of things, and perhaps end up with useless degrees that end up being very useful.
Yeah. So could you go through what are your degrees that you have?
Yeah, so I have a Bachelor of it's a BA, Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, actually from UNCG, and then I have a Master of Architecture from Virginia Tech, and that's what we call a professional degree. That's the degree that allowed me to go on and do internship and sit the exam and get licensed. And then I also have a Master of Philosophy degree in History and Theory from the University of Manchester in England, where I taught for a couple of years.
So you said that you worked in construction. Was that between, in the summers while you were getting educated? Was that between high school and college? Like, when were you working construction?
It was actually, I started doing that kind of work in high school, and then it ended up doing summers and so forth. Yeah, and especially when I decided I was going to go to architecture school, I made sure that I had some construction job in the summer, until I got into architecture school, and then I did internships. I worked for architecture firms in the summer.
Did both of your parents graduate from college?
Yes, my dad had an electrical engineering degree, which was a 4-year, a bachelor's degree, and my mom had a 2-year degree that qualified her to be an executive secretary, and which is what she ended up doing for quite a few years. So, I mean, they were of the generation that really first, had a high percentage of people getting college degrees. Before that, it wasn't so common.
Yeah. So when you got your first degree and then you realized you'd rather actually be doing something else, were you sort of nervous about spending so much time getting another degree, and either the time or maybe the finances?
Well, it actually, in retrospect, who knows? I mean, memories are plastic.
Yeah.
And very malleable. We always remember things from the present. But to the best of my knowledge, I wasn't nervous about that because I'd done the math. In other words, I saw that if I just went 2 more years in undergrad, and got that degree and then went and did the 3-year master's program, it would actually be more cost effective and time effective than transferring and doing a Bachelor of Architecture, which would have taken me 5 years.
Yeah.
So I say, in 5 years, I can get a Master of Architecture. And so that's why I decided to finish it. Besides the fact that I was really happy at UNCG and having a blast.
I'm from Greensboro, so
so
it's
you know
my
it.
old stomping grounds.
Yeah.
So could you describe the difference between Masters of Philosophy and a Doctor of Philosophy?
Yeah, it is. It's the history of it is in the English system. Was that it was you might say the retreat degree for PhD students who weren't going to make it, right? So they instead of the doctor, they get the master's, and at least that's how it was explained to me. Then it turned into a degree in and of itself. And so the difference between them, and this is, I had explored doing a PhD, because I decided when I was in grad school I wanted to teach, and in part because of Virginia Tech, its culture at the time was very much oriented to educating future teachers, future professors, and.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Is that one of the reasons you chose to go there, or did you find that?
No, I discovered that after I got there. I mean, that's the way our lives are. I went to UNCG to do English and discovered that it actually had a real strength in their English department, some real luminaries in their English department. And then I got to Virginia Tech, and it was actually different from what I expected. I went there because I thought this is a real practical place, and it was anything but. It was a very experimental program. So, but I decided to go into teaching, and so I explored doing a PhD. A PhD is a very long program where you do a lot of coursework before you can focus on your research and ultimately your dissertation. I was at the university, in the University of Manchester, and just had a conversation with the department head. I was there teaching full time. I was on a couple of visiting appointments.
You were already there before you decided to actually take courses there?
That's right. And he explained the MPhil to me, which just absolutely clicked because he said, there's no courses. It's just research.
Yeah. Okay.
And I basically said, when can I start? Right? So I began it there. The other thing is you could teach full time and work on your degree there.
Wow. Yeah.
The English system is quite different, much more, at least at the time, much more flexible than the American system. I'm not saying it was better, but it was better for me. And then I finished it after we moved back to the States.
Was there you said you were more interested in research. Was there specific research that you were wanting to do that you had in mind when you got the offer of being able to have the Masters of Philosophy?
Yeah, I didn't have any trouble coming up with a research topic. I wanted to research sacred places. I wanted to learn in depth about places of significance, of cultural significance, of religious significance, of ritual significance and symbolic significance, which was really a product of my education at Virginia Tech, even though I didn't really know it at the time.
Really? Interesting.
And in talking with the department head in Manchester, who ended up being, my advisor for the degree, he guided me in a particular way that really helped me to frame my topic. And so there were really two components. One I brought with me, which was firstly interested in sacred places, and a real interest in what I ended up calling spatial sequences and symbolic narratives. And that really came out of my teaching that I'd been doing back in the States on a part-time basis before moving to England, which was in a first-year program where we taught a course, a studio called Path and Place. And it was all about how to navigate through space and end up at some significant ending point. And then my advisor, Roger Stonehouse, very good name for an architect, and whom I'm still in touch with, he introduced me to the case study method, and which looks at what we now, we quite readily call precedent research, but it's really looking at, it's beyond precedents as just examples to illustrate one thing. The case study method is you look in depth at case studies as a means to both explicate, right, your particular line of inquiry and validate, right, your thesis. So between those two, in retrospect, it didn't take me long to feel like I was really on the track that I wanted to be on.
Yeah, I think also for that particular research, you're much better suited to be in England, I would imagine, because they have so many fantastic cathedrals and things like that. So could you describe what your thesis, your Master's of Philosophy thesis was, and could you maybe explain it in simple terms?
Yeah, well, it was about spatial sequences and symbolic narratives, at sacred places, and it was based not only on the case study method, but on the comparative method. In other words, it was looking at what also gets called pattern recognition. Right? I was looking at this point at similarities, repeating patterns that one would find pan-culturally and trans-historically.
So not just in England.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, all over the world. So, and so it looked at examples from around the world and analyzed very specific examples in terms of the spatial sequences, how physically they were made, thresholds, nodal points, steep steps, compression, expansion, all the things that we work with as architects, and how that related to liturgy, ritual, mythology, etc. So, for example, one and this of course now in retrospect it was a great choice because it's been a perfect excuse to do a lot of travel. I've traveled around the world, and as part of it, my wife and I actually literally traveled around the world one summer. We bought around the world plane tickets.
That's awesome.
Which are they're I believe you can. I think we looked this up just out of curiosity. I think you can still do it. They were flexible. You didn't have to just keep going. You could, and they were good for a year and had two different carriers that. So it was flexible enough, and so we did a lot of traveling, and ended up in Japan. And I had a connection through Manchester with a university in Kyoto, which was very fortunate. I had a professor I got paired with there, and had a master's student who was my guide and translator. It couldn't have been better. And I really focused there on, who knows how I found it. I bet you I was led in some ways by my the professor I work with in Japan or some of the professors back in Manchester, but I landed on one particular monastery in Kyoto. Turns out is one of the more famous, it's a World Heritage Site, all that, called Daitokaji. The Japanese Zen Buddhist monasteries are, there's certain specific things about how they were organized. And they were organized according to what in English got called sub-temples. In other words, an organization of a lot of different small communities of monks, all with their own, kind of place where they practiced, mostly meditation.
This was all inside the same temple.
And all inside a quite large compound that had, along with it, the main temples for ceremonies that, periodically, occurred where, the monks, and particularly the senior monks from the different sub-temples would come together. So, and I landed on a couple of the sub-temples, and it just so happens that these temples had remarkable path sequences, just candy for architects in terms of how skillfully they were designed. So first of all, just looking at physically and spatially how sophisticated the design was of these temples. One in particular is called Kotuin, and it's dates from the late 16th century, and it's a typical wooden Japanese domestic architecture, really based on domestic architecture, which takes some getting used to for Westerners to say that's a sacred place, and it certainly was, but not in the way we often understand a religious setting. By the way, when I first arrived at that monastery, it scared me to death because I didn't understand anything. I didn't know what I was going to do because it all seemed wickedly foreign to me. But through the help...
Like you were afraid that you wouldn't know what to analyze? Or
I wouldn't know what to do. I had no idea how to start. And so I started from, a place of absolute emptiness and confusion. Not a bad place to start, actually. So at the end of the day, of course, it became a very rich place to study, and the reason why I'm recalling this one is because it's a place I've revisited in writing many times because of its richness. So, because it related the entire past sequence, which you have to kind of understand, look at some of my photographs and probably read my writing to really understand what I'm talking about. But it was fairly short. But what I discovered was that spatially and temporally, it felt much longer. And I was bringing in research on environmental psychology. It was a very multidisciplinary study I ended up doing. And human perception, how we perceive space, how we perceive time, and so forth. So that this started it really opened up a whole world on how ultimately where I end up with sacred architecture is the power of the built environment, how much it can affect us with a capital A, and how important it's been culturally, politically, throughout the ages. Right? And that is ultimately where my research has gone to, is recognizing that the built environment is extraordinarily important for a full spectrum of reasons, from the very practical, we need good housing. Everybody deserves housing, right? Because home is so significant to our lives, to the symbolic, power of architecture.
Something that I was thinking about that I thought related to your research is, so most religious buildings around the world, they are dependent upon, like, or they're sort of based on the architecture of their region, and like that vernacular architecture is normally based on like what resources were readily available to make building materials.
The types of materials and yeah.
So I'm curious, now that we have such a globalized economy and anywhere in the world you can build the exact same building, that is going to change, and it is changing the way that our temples and churches are looking. They're becoming more similar throughout the globe. They're looking more similar. How do you think that is affecting the way that our cultural and religious outlook is changing?
Well, once you open up, once the whole territory opened up of a flow of materials and a flow of design cultures and a flow of building cultures, because if you look at, medieval Japanese architecture, it looked the way it did, not only because of the materials that, the local materials that they were using, but because of the building culture, but also the building guilds, the organized guilds of carpenters who built all these places.
Yeah.
So once that goes away and you end up, with a much more globalized culture, right? Then, of course, that opens up, a realm of possibilities, and what appears to be almost limitless choices. And without going into a long disquisition on how the discipline of architecture has responded to the conditions of modernization and modernity, ultimately, it resulted in both some really remarkable architecture and some very confused periods of architecture, because it's new territory. And what we're discovering now is a return to the limits that produced some of what we now kind of consider to be some of the great architecture of the world. You think about the Western Christian cathedral and abbey churches and monasteries. They came out of, actually, in some ways, a proto-global culture. And Christianity, from its onset, was a cosmopolitan religion. It was not based in any one place.
Yeah.
And yet you can, trace its lineage from Roman architecture. The early Christian, Western Christian church, of course, depended almost entirely on the legacy of Roman building techniques and building organizations, and particularly the civic hall of the basilica, who in turn borrowed from Egyptian sources, and then changed and grew as it disseminated initially throughout Western Europe. But it had similar limitations that I've already noted with the Japanese. Now what we're finding is, in a world with what we erroneously believed were endless possibilities, we know that there's all consequences. Mm-hmm. So what we're now looking at, I think quite rightfully, is first of all looking at where do your materials come from? And what is the embodied energy? If you're shipping travertine from Italy to Raleigh, North Carolina, you are burning a lot of fuel, not only to extract it, but to ship it.
Yeah.
We're also very concerned about, so who's extracting this stone that's coming from this part of the world that we know has unethical labor practices, or child labor and so forth, right? So now, right, the limitations start to become self-imposed. And so there's the kind of ethical realm of self-imposed or self-aware limitations. There's also design considerations of self-imposed or self-recognized limitations, where you may choose to respond to the local building cultures, the historic building cultures, and work within those. Often a fairly practical thing to do too. I mean, you want to make use of the traditions that have existed for generations in a particular area. So that's part of how we're the profession and the discipline is at the moment. Just as a brief introduction, a lot more complicated.
Yeah, I personally would like to see I could tolerate like a contemporary take, but I would like to see more references to like vernacular architecture and also using more regional materials, because I find that like I don't want to go to another country to see the same buildings that I see back home. I want to see what makes them different than us. I like that aspect of travel a lot.
Yeah.
So I have I'd like to switch more towards housing policy. So you contributed to the Raleigh Unified Development Ordinance. Could you explain like the main changes that this ordinance brought to the city's urban planning vision, and what were the motivations behind them?
Yeah. Okay. So the change to the UDO was that it became legal to build accessory dwelling units.
And how long ago did that happen?
It happened in 2020.
Okay, so relatively recent.
Relatively recently. And the short version of the story of how that came to be is what I think is a good story. And that I've been running housing studios and had worked with the city before, and the person who ran the planning department had an urban design center, and the director of that came to me and said, this was in 2013, came and said, we just approved the new Unified Development Ordinance, and at the last minute, they took accessory dwelling units out of the ordinance. And he said, could you help us with this? There's one neighborhood in Raleigh that we know really supported this, and maybe we can work with them. And of course I said yes. Now, just for your listeners, an accessory dwelling unit is a historic building type. In other words, it's been part of the American building culture for a very long time. And it is simply either an attached smaller unit. In other words, it's a small unit in a larger house that has a separate entrance, or it's a standalone unit behind the house. What often get called garage apartments, it's the apartment above the garage, or it's without the garage. And they get named in-law flats, granny flats, etc. So they had been legal in Raleigh up until the 1970s. And you can find them throughout the inner city neighborhoods of Raleigh. Forest Park, Oakwood, Mordecai, Boylan Heights, and so forth. And they have a lot of value because they're smaller. They tend to be more affordable because it's giving a housing choice between a single-family house and an apartment building, and also provide flexibility for families because if your kid moves back home and they're too old to live in your house anymore, they can live there.
Yeah.
Your mom needs help, doesn't want to live in her house anymore, she can live in the accessory dwelling unit. You get old and move in the accessory dwelling unit and rent out the main house. So these are part of the arguments for it. It just turns out that we were just hopping on a national movement.
Yeah.
That is, it's like ADU, not as what we call them now, accessory dwelling, ADU madness across the states. Yeah. And so we ran the project in the fall of 2014, and I ran it as a research. All my advanced design students are research and design projects, and it's design as research as well. So the students did a lot of research on what was happening with accessory dwelling units, nationally, looking at cities who had gotten out ahead of this. We looked at local examples, right? We just made the argument in some of the public forums that we ran was, what are you all getting nervous about this? But there's accessory dwelling units all over your neighborhood. Yeah. We're not dreaming up anything new here. We're reviving a historically significant housing type. So now to bring this, I'll just quickly do this. We concluded this at the end of 2014 and ran a big public forum. We had about 100 people show up. There's a lot of excitement around the project. And we worked in the Mordecai neighborhood. And they were very enthusiastic. And it was a wonderful project. I had great students, all graduate students. And we paired them up with people who lived in the neighborhood, who were obviously, we sent out a survey and we said, anybody want to work with these students? They'll design an ADU for you. Yeah. And so the students got clients. They were absolutely happy. We were all happy. And so we concluded it. And then the students, of course, they move on. I can't hold them. They did great work. They moved on. They graduated. But I ended up taking on the role of being an advocate for what now we more readily call zoning reform. Mm-hmm. Reforming the zoning to provide, in this case, greater diversity of housing. So the first thing that happened is that the Mordecai Citizen Advisory Council petitioned City Council to create a special condition where ADUs could be built in the Mordecai neighborhood. And that's what got the ball rolling. Well, as I like to say, it took us 6 years and 2 city councils until we finally got an ordinance that allowed accessory dwelling units citywide, what we call by right. Right? Mm-hmm. It's just like if you want to build a single-family house on your property, that's by right. You don't have any special permission as long as you, comply with zoning and building codes. Same thing with ADUs now. Yeah. So, so that I think it's a good example on the role that certainly universities like NC State can play. Yeah, we're a land grant, and we're here to provide high quality education at still not premium tuition to the citizenry of North Carolina, and do research to serve the citizenry. Yeah. So that gives a wonderful kind of responsibility and opportunity for professors like me, who see the power of the built environment to improve people's lives, and can use my position as a professor to, first of all, give my students an enriched educational experience. I never lose sight of that. I tell everybody, I said, okay, you want us to do this project for you, but the education of my students comes first. But we'll give you a good product and you'll be able to do something with it.
Yeah.
Right? And then to see policy change because of that, I think it's everybody wins.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great idea. And I think actually more professors, it seems sort of underutilized that using, your student researchers to actually make an impact in the community. So I'd just like to close out with, so if you had to give some advice to a student that's considering becoming a professor, what piece of advice would you give to them?
Well, love knowledge and be endlessly curious.
Mm-hmm.
And then put in a real large measure of care and compassion, and then top it off with a good frothy top of optimism and vision for a better future.
Mm-hmm.
If you put all those together, then you should teach.
Yeah, that sounds like a good advice.
We're in an optimistic profession here.